Hello everybody, and we are live. It's the view from the top. It is the beginning of Easter week this week. It's Passover and we're in the middle of Ramadan. It is an important week, and we've got an important subject that we are going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about remote work, and that is such an important issue. A couple of years ago, everybody was working remotely because of the pandemic, but how have things changed now? How has the dust settled? We're going to be talking about remote work, the myth and the reality. And we've got some great people in our audience today, and we've got some great people in the studio today. So we've got Dharmesh Kathari, we've got Chris Monticelli, we've got Ola Yuba, we've got John Lee, and of course we've got Julia Onslow Cole. So we've got a great session today. Our producer Tally is on vacation, but I've noticed she's in the audience, so shout out to Tally. Always good to see you, and have a great vacation, Tally. You shouldn't be here, you should be having a holiday, but great to see you in the audience nonetheless. So what have we got to talk about today and on the show? As I said, we're talking about remote work, which is going to be a load of fun. But you know how it works. You can also get your codes. So if you want to get codes from ERC or from SHRM or from HRCI, these are the credits for today. So if you want your credits, then just take a screenshot or take a photo or write them down with pen and paper. Many thanks to our friends at Worldwide ERC for the GMS and CRP credits, and of course to our friends at Rocket Mortgage and Lisa Fontana in particular for getting us the HRCI and the SHRM codes. I'll leave those up there for a moment, so you've got that. Another point I'd like to say is next week we're going to run a competition. We're running a competition in conjunction with the Forum for Expatriate Management for their Americas event in Dallas on May the 3rd and 4th, and indeed the Emmas. And if you would like to win a free ticket to the Emmas, and as well as 3 nights free accommodation and indeed free attendance at the show, then please join us next week when we're going to be doing a live draw. If that's not enough to make you want to come and join us next week, even more exciting is our special guest next week on The View from the Top is Mark Eckert, who's the head of global mobility at Uber, so a really iconic tech company, and he's going to be telling us all about global mobility at Uber. So we've got a great show lined up for you next week. Of course, every week we have some breaking news we like to share. So let's see what is this week's breaking news from around our industry. Let's have a look. Congratulations everyone who's been promoted, everyone who's switched job, got new job roles, all sorts of exciting things happening there. And also, and I think it's really exciting, there's lots of job opportunities out there. I know that there are companies that are having layoffs at the moment, and there can be some hard times out there, but don't despair. There's lots of really good jobs out there, and we picked a few of them. They're out there, and we'll put, as we get them, we'll put more and more jobs out there each week. So that's really exciting. Lots of good jobs out there. So the first stage of our show each week, of course, is we talk immigration. And as ever, we have with us Julia Onslow Cole. So let's move straight into that and let's talk immigration.
Brian.
Julia, hi, how are you?
Very well, thanks. Yes.
And where are you today?
I'm in Cornwall. I'm by the sea, but I'm not like John by the sea in hot weather. I'm by the sea in cold weather and raining.
But I gather it's Port Isaac, which for those who have ever watched the BBC programme Doc Martin, is where that's set. I don't know how worldwide that show is, but it's been running many years. So anyway, Julia, you're working remotely. So why don't we talk a little bit about what's going on in the world of immigration on remote working?
Great. So one of the biggest trends that we've seen over, the last year or two is this whole trend for immigration categories to deal with remote working. And obviously it started in the pandemic. And most of these digital nomad remote working schemes, they started in about the mid 2020s, and they've been refined as the nature of what is remote working has changed. And that's obviously what we're going to be talking about. So I'm really excited to listen to what everyone has to say. If you look at it from an immigration perspective, then you really put people into three different buckets. So the first is remote workers, and remote workers for purposes of immigration are individuals who work outside of a traditional office, often their home, or it could be a hotel, and it's usually beyond commuting distance and sometimes in another country. Then you get digital nomads, and they're workers who use technology to perform their work across any location, often combining it with travel and tourism, and mostly moving across borders. And then you get telecommuters, and they're people who work remotely, either from their residence or another workspace, but they're actually within commuting distance of their employer, and they're not actually on site. So they're not on a client site. So these are the three kind of major different definitions which you see if you look globally at all the different schemes. And there's about 35 countries now in the world that have really established digital nomad programs. And most of these programs have the same sorts of features. So they all authorize you to stay in the country and work for a specified period, provided you comply with three things. So the first is that your employer always has to be outside of that country, or you have to be self-employed. The second is that you don't intend to enter the local labor market or perform any work for a company in the country or provide any goods and services for companies in that country.
You couldn't be a remote hairdresser, for example.
No. And then you must meet the minimum annual earnings requirement. And in some cases, you could, in lieu of that, give capital funds, or in some cases, both. Now, you can see that for countries, this has been an amazingly attractive thing. I think the estimated loss of global export revenue from tourism for the year 2020 was $1.3 trillion. So that's how much. It's an incredible amount. And so we have seen this, and we've particularly heard lots of stories about the Caribbean, which were one of the first group of countries that started these digital nomad schemes, how it's really drawn visitors, how it's drawn earnings into the country, how it's replenished their lost tourism revenue. And it's also helped them be globally competitive, because there's lots of stories from governments about how if you attract this population, you then get a lot of entrepreneurs. So there's countries that are about to have schemes: Albania, Czech Republic, Grenada, Indonesia, Italy, Slovakia. But it's too early, I think, to really evaluate the success. And I'd be very interested to get John's comments on this, because there has beginning to be quite some negative comments about some of the digital schemes. So if you look at Portugal, where John is, as at December of last year, there were 15,800 people on digital nomads in Lisbon. But there has been a kind of real backlash, and there's been some demonstrations earlier this year, just saying that people are feeling that, you know, the country or the city is really struggling to accommodate everyone, and it's putting pressure on housing and infrastructure. And so I think this whole idea is really got to be constantly under review. The other thing I would say, and I'm just going to end here, is that
I just want to pick up a question actually before you do, Julia. This is from Jody Harris. She says, so digital nomad visas often do not work where the employer has a local presence.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, Jody, my own experience is that in the pandemic, I had to go and work in Dubai, and I ran into trouble immediately with a remote working visa, and that's when I actually swapped visas because of that very thing.
Cool.
So
okay.
the last point I wanted to make was that initially, when employers were looking at allowing people to work remotely, we were often asked, you know, can we get them a digital nomad visa or some type of visa? But now what I'm seeing in the market, and obviously I'd be very interested, Brian, to see what everyone else has got to say, is that when you have these policies, which are now much better defined, they actually say that you have to already have immigration permission in that country. So either you can go to a country for a very short period of time, which would actually allow you to probably go as a visitor if you're, say, taking a bit of a break rather than actually working. But it's not really expecting to support you getting a remote work visa. So I think that's kind of another interesting development.
Okay, so Julia, thank you so much for that. We're going to bring on our Changemaker in a moment. Before we do, I just want to remind people about our Top 100 Diversity Initiative. And I'll just run that video and just remind people, and we'll say goodbye to you at this point, Julia. So Julia, or to the audience, please, you know how it works. Hit the heart button, hit the like button, hit the applause button. Let's say a big, big thank you to the wonderful, I can see it lighting up now, the screen's going mad with lights, the wonderful Julia Onslow Cole. And we're going to talk now about the Top 100 Diversity Initiative. So we're still open for nominations, but not for much longer. So if you haven't nominated, please do go onto the Benevo website and nominate. But we're looking to release in a couple of months' time the top 100 diversity champions in our industry. So if you know people who you think are big supporters of DE&I through whichever lens you want to look at it through, if they're DE&I champions, then please do submit their names, and we will celebrate diversity in our industry in the not too distant future. Meanwhile, we're now going to move on, and we're going to bring on our wonderful Changemaker. We have a wonderful group of Changemakers, and indeed, if you would like to be a Changemaker, then do message us and let us know. But without further ado, let's bring on our Changemaker for the day, who is the wonderful, the truly wonderful Olu Ayuba. Olu, we are so excited to have you as the guest on our show today, as our change maker. Because, well, tell us about yourself. Tell us a bit about your background. How did you get into mobility?
It's a long story. First of all, thank you for inviting me to your show.
It's such a pleasure.
Great
It's an
to be
honor to
here.
have you on the show, Olu.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been working in mobility for quite a while now, but actually, my background is actually in HR. So I worked in different areas of HR, recruitment, training, and all that. But at some point, I had a job with a multinational company based in the UK, actually, BAT. So they just set up a factory in Nigeria. So the team I was working with actually were the ones actually helping the expats in Nigeria. So that was how I got into mobility. So I was helping with all sorts of things.
Hey, look at this. I'm going to come in. Look at this from Anil. Some of the comments you're getting. People love you, Olu. It's just, so Anil says, I'm not sure which company Anil is with. He says,
Anil works with us.
Oh, he's with you. Okay. He says,
Yes.
Olu is a great human being and a big supporter of your progress. Happy to see you here. And I've got to read this. I'm going to read this out. I hope I don't embarrass you too much, Olu, but I want the audience to hear this. Okay. You know how people have got on LinkedIn, there's testimonials that people write. I want to read you the testimonial that Kristin Dardani, another one of our wonderful guests and change makers, wrote about you, Olu. Just listen to this. Olu Yuba is simply my favorite colleague across my 30-year plus career in the advertising industry. It goes without saying that he is a rock-solid global HR talent specializing in mobility and talent management. The amazingly successful global mobility program at Mediacom, which he co-architected and managed, is a testament to his craft skills. But what is really special about Olu is his wisdom, maturity, proactivity, tolerance, bravery, business acumen, global literacy, relationship skills, even temper, perseverance, and kindness. It was my privilege to work alongside him as his manager for 8+ years, and I still aspire to be just like him when I grow up. I have never, ever heard a testimonial as glowing as that. That is unbelievable, Olu. People love you, and it's an honor.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Kristin and I actually set up the mobility program for Mediacom. So we worked together to set it up.
So tell us about the program, because Mediacom is now Essence Mediacom. So tell us a bit about the program there.
So we actually merged in January 31st this year. So Essence is our sister company. So we are an advertising agency. We're part of WPP and Group M. We're headquartered in London. We are one of the largest advertising agencies in the world. And we offer truly integrated media solutions for our clients. We're 8,000. Now we're about 10,000 people. And
how many do you move? How many do you move?
Yeah, we have offices in 120 locations in 96 markets. And in terms of moving, we've moved in the last 9+ years. We've actually moved about 1,100 people. And our program is actually talent focused, because if someone wants to have an international career in the organization, the first place they come to is global mobility. They need to come and talk to us. So we make the magic happen. So most of our moves are hand raisers, from the entry level to C-suite. Everybody has a fair chance to mobility. So
you make the magic happen. I just love that. That's so cool.
Yes.
And also, as a change maker, of course, we help you support a charity of your choosing. Tell us a bit about your charity that you've chosen.
Yeah, so the charity's name is Heritage Outreach. It's actually it was actually my wife that actually introduced me to the charity. So what they do is they take care of orphans. As you know, in Nigeria, there's a part of Nigeria that has some issues with militants. So
that's the Boko Haram, is it?
Yes, Boko Haram. So some of the children, they've lost their parents. So this charity actually helps to take care of some of them, and also some people from other parts of the country. They actually shelter them. They give them food. They send them to school. they have people that look after them in the shelter. So it's really, really huge work they do. As you know, there are over 153 million people that are orphans, according to the UNICEF. So it's a huge work, they're doing. And there's a run every year to raise money. That's the 10K run, the London 10K run. So I will be taking part this year. So I'll also be helping raise money on that front.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Olu, we're going to love you and leave you now, and we're going to be moving on to talk about remote work with the panel. There's an advertising theme in the show today because we've got Pris on from Publicis and others who've got advertising experience. So we're going to say goodbye to you, but everybody, Thank you. How it works. Please hit the heart button, hit the like button, hit the applause button. Let's say goodbye and thank you. And Mobility loves you, Olu.
Thank you.
Comments we were getting there, they just love you. So hit those buttons big time, everybody. And then also let's welcome onto stage our wonderful guests as we start talking about remote work. Wow, what a panel we've got today. Oh, Olu, we've left you on stage, and have I got everybody else we have? But you know what, 6 works. So if you're up for it, Olu, we'll keep you on stage too. Anyway, so let's keep on. I'm just fascinated by this subject of remote work. It is such a big issue. Maybe just start off with, can we define it a bit? I mean, Russ, maybe if I can start with you, Russ Haney from Beniva. How do you define remote work?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of ways companies define it, but I'm going to talk about it in 3 main categories, which are temporary remote work, permanent remote work, and hybrid remote work. Temporary remote work is usually defined as a period of work outside of one's regular office location, and overwhelmingly, it's usually defined within a period of less than 30 days. Most companies would say it's in the range of about 21 to 30 days. Permanent remote work is outside of the office location on a full-time basis and indefinite duration. But really, since the easing of the pandemic, we've seen hybrid remote work arrangements really emerge as the predominantly adopted model. And this is basically a mix of work inside and outside of an office location. And the prevalence of these arrangements varies, but according to recent surveys done by Deloitte and Vialto Partners, both of which had over 800 HR participants, about a quarter of respondents support temporary remote work, another quarter are supporting permanent remote work. But really well more than half and up to even 3/4 of some companies reported having these hybrid work arrangements in place. And it really depends on the survey. There is some variance there, but really it's the hybrid remote work models that have emerged as the most predominant.
Well, we'll get into that because I think things are changing. I mean, obviously there was a time a couple of years ago when everybody was working, everybody who could, apart from emergency workers, was working remotely because that was just the way of the world. And I think initially everybody thought that, with the Great Resignation, very much the boot was on the foot of the employee and that everybody was going to be able to work remotely. But it's changing. And I noticed, I think, Dharmesh, you brought it to my attention, is that that Meta, Facebook, have actually, there's just been some sort of press comment on them just today or yesterday. So Dharmesh, do you want to tell us a bit about what you found there?
So I just want to say that across various organizations right now, that there is a bit of a pause in terms of revisiting the remote work policy. Obviously, there are a couple of variables to kind of look out something in the external environment, the business environment, as well as the regulatory environment. We do see that while in the current cost-conscious environment, the remote work policy has been kind of revisited to understand whether an employer wants to even sponsor the work visas for the employees to work remotely, or at the same time want to make sure that there's enough collaboration between tax and mobility and HR to ensure that we don't have any larger risks around, especially PE risks, around approving some of the remote work arrangements. Because as I said, in the external environment, from a regulatory standpoint, we see government is now, this is taking attention to the government as well, given the fact that there has been a big explosion of people who are now working remote. I think somewhere I also read that in the US alone, I think in 2019, there were 3.9 million employees working full-time remote. In 2022, it's more than 11 million employees working full-time remote. So,
wow, sorry, just say those numbers again. It went up from what to what? Just repeat those numbers.
So it is in 2019, I think this is pre-pandemic, it was 3.9 million, which is now moved to 11.1 million in 2022, by the end of 2022.
So it's quadrupled, yeah.
Yes, and so this kind of explosion obviously is getting attention from government as well, just to make sure that there are proper compliances in place as well. So I think the pause in the remote work policy is kind of I think it's a multi-purpose way of evaluating it. One is obviously your business, your current business reality, whether you are open to having, especially in the context of international remote work, where you're open to having more such roles on international remote work, especially in the temporary side. And as well as from a regulatory standpoint, you want to make sure that you're not adding more costs to the organization in the current business environment as well. So it's a bit of a real pause on really defining what is remote work and what are the current guardrails we want to put in place as an organization.
Okay, that's really helpful. John, just bringing you into the conversation. I mean, your company, Work From Anywhere, is literally the name of your business. So you guys are all about remote work. Tell us a bit about it. I mean, in fact, tell us a bit about yourself and how you started it, because you do work remotely, don't you? So tell us.
Yeah, exactly. So my eldest daughter, Rosa, she's 6 and she's already been to 25 countries. That'll give you a pretty good idea. In the last 4 years, We've lived in Thailand, the Netherlands, Ireland, and in Portugal. So the company, basically what we have is it's basically a platform that helps you within 60 seconds get to the answers for what are the risks and also the likely solutions for both temporary remote work, but also for the talent acquisition if you want to hire somebody from a different country remotely, whether you have a legal entity or not, basically. So it kind of measures the tax risks, including permanent establishment, as well as immigration, employment law, things like that. So anybody can go onto the website and have a play around with it themselves. But for my own journey with this, I guess, it's been fascinating because when we started out in 2021, we spoke to a number of companies, and you could see a big difference in the companies that were really in the battle for talent, that wanted to push policy out there to get it out there, but also the ones that were more conservative. And I think what we're seeing now is maybe certainly a meeting of the middle. I think companies really are recognizing the risks. They're recognizing they need to get the policies in place. They recognize they need to get the technology in place. But also, I think what's kind of still missing a little bit in the discussion, this comes through the data, and this comes through a recent Mercer survey. 89% of companies do not have any metrics to track the success of international remote working. So I think there's still a bit of work to do in figuring out how do you measure success? How do you measure the fact you can reduce your attrition or not? How do you measure how does it fit the needs of your workforce? And how does it fit with your, let's say, risk appetite? I mean, that can vary as well.
Okay, well, maybe we'll get into some of that in the moment. Olu, if I just ask you, whereabouts in your organization does remote work sit? Is that within the mobility function or elsewhere in HR?
Yeah, it's the mobility function. So the mobility function actually has a huge say on the policy and the implementation of the policy. And I think it's because of the risk involved. So tax, we work directly with tax to actually draft the policy. So it's the risk involved that made it like that.
Okay, so effectively, the mobility function is expanding into a whole new area of remote work, which I think nicely brings me on to bringing Pris into the conversation, because you guys have done some amazing stuff on, I think you call it Work Your World. So tell us a bit about yourself and what you guys at Publicis have done with remote working. And this is temporary remote working we're talking about in your case, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I am the ambassador for our Working World program at Publicis Group, and that means basically I am the person responsible for the mobility part of the program. It's an interfunctional program, so it just doesn't sit with mobility. We have a committee from different functions that work through the program to make sure that it's offering our people freedom and flexibility, and it's compliant, it's as cost neutral as possible. So we launched it last year, in January of last year. So we've had it for a full year now, and it is a success because the numbers we expected to come through in terms of requests were exceeded, which is more than we expected.
Okay, and how many? And people can work remotely anywhere they want in the world, or I mean, how remote can they be?
Well, so it is work your world, so it has to be your world, and that's the operative. Yours operative, so you have to have the right to work in that country, and where we have a possibility to do remote work, like like Julia mentioned, where there's nomad visas and that sort of thing. We work quite closely with Fragment to ensure that we are compliant from an immigration, social security, tax, even from sort of health, especially for within Europe, it's a big thing. So duty of care. So it's a full spectrum of assessment that goes through our team to ensure that we are doing it as well as possible from a compliant perspective, and it's also as easy access to everyone as possible.
Okay, and someone's put a comment here. Let's just pull that one up. This is from Davinia. I don't know if she works with you. Everyone is using it, even our leadership. Is Davinia also at Publicis? Is she working with you?
Yes.
Okay, so even the leadership is using it. So that's amazing. And there's a YouTube video that people can look at. And how long can people work over in a different location for? Is it permanently or?
It's up to 6 weeks. So the program is up to 6 weeks, and it renews every year. So people have an opportunity to either work in the same place every year or move around the world. What has been a surprise for us, because we started out with seeing a lot of people going back to their home, what would have been their original home countries. But the number of people who are actually just going to a place they've never been to before and sharing their experiences on our MassExcel platform is incredible. Some of the stories that we're seeing, what people are discovering is great.
Okay, there's a comment that's come in from Lynn Mecca. I'll just pull that up here. And Lynn says, if remote work policy is offering tax equalization benefits to protect the employer, is this making the traditional commuter policy obsolete? And I hadn't really thought about that. Views, please? Anyone want to answer that?
It raises an interesting question. I mean, I've counseled a lot of clients on how remote work policies intersect mobility policies, and I think it is something that companies have to contend with. It's not always that remote work policies are going to trigger a traditional mobility set of benefits, but when they do, it is really interesting that there are overlapping competencies and requirements, and which of those prevail or don't prevail. And these are questions that companies certainly do have to contend with.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of companies offering tax equalization benefits on remote work. It tends to be more treated as self-initiated. Is that your experience, Olu or Chris?
Yeah, I mean, if someone wants to go and work the permanent remote work, I mean, you have to go on the local pay scale, and there's no tax equalization. I mean, some people would love to earn what they're earning in London, in maybe in another location or low-cost location, but that's not possible. We just have to push back on it,
I want to talk a bit about the pushback, because we started talking about it, but we didn't get into as much detail. Is this Meta announcement? As I understand it, Meta have said that they're rolling back on their remote work policy for new hires. Does somebody want to come in on that? I think is that something you think, John? Yeah.
One of the things that we've seen, and even some of the most some of the most avid remote work proponents would also say that it's really crucial, to, especially for new joiners, to get that right. And for some companies, having the new joiners spend some time in the office can be a real benefit. But I think where it gets really interesting is, if you look at, would you say pre-pandemic we nailed management and we all did a great job of it? We've been doing it for hundreds of years, and yet we hadn't quite got it right even pre-pandemic, most of us would say. So it's also fair to say that it will take a while to settle down and evolve with remote work and learn how to do this and to do this right.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, where do we think this might sort of pan out? Where do we think this is going to end up? Russ, I'd be interested in your views on that.
I would say, it is a pendulum swing that we're seeing. As John said, coming out of the pandemic, it's interesting to see companies take these stances of trying to bring people back into the office. But what I found interesting in some of the surveys I've seen is that companies are saying one of the motivations for adopting remote work policies and really putting the effort to defining those benefits is that they're having to respond to people that simply are refusing to come back into the office. So, we do have to consider that there is a balance of power at play here between the employer and the employee. And that certainly varies between industries and companies. But, I think companies have to weigh, how much say do we have in dictating that people actually come back full time into the office, and will we lose people? So that definitely has to be considered.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to ask the audience a question. Out there in the audience, let us know whether you personally work remotely. And I'll give you 3 choices. We'll say yes, full-time, part-time, in other words, hybrid, or no, I'm in office. So I'm interested to see how many of our audience are in the office most of the time, how many are in the office virtually never, and how many do maybe 2 to 3 days a week. So it'd be interesting to see where people come out on that.
Yeah, so while we get the poll, I think a couple of points I want to also make is that we have also observed organizations trying to rationalize their real estate in terms of, that's a huge cost-saving opportunity for a lot of organizations to kind of move to hybrid model, which has resulted in some very good cost savings for their real estate costs. So even that also has its own level of play in terms of deciding, let's say, hybrid versus full, everybody coming back to office. So sometimes they're also limited by their choices to not have full team coming back to office, but maybe operating in a hybrid way or attending on a few days in the week. So I think that's the new way of work, which has been kind of become very, very normal in today's times.
Okay, we've had loads of answers coming through, so I'll just try and, you're probably seeing them they're all everybody, but we've got, I think a lot of people in the audience are working remotely full time. Loads and loads of them. There's some hybrid. So here's Caroline. She's hybrid. Rebecca is full time remote. Mena's full time remote. Louise is hybrid. So if I had to guess, I'd say we've got about. I think we might have as much as maybe 70% fully remote, 20% hybrid, and only about 10% who are actually in the office. Here's one who's Jennifer. I'm not sure where Jennifer works. Hybrid, 3 days required in office. Gabriel is part-time. Irena is hybrid. A few more hybrids. I think there's a comment here. Somebody said that they've been forced back into the office. Here we are. This is from Rod Falanga. Unfortunately, been forced to return to office. So we're seeing that come. We're seeing that come through. So it's quite interesting, though, isn't it? That it seems that the majority still, and maybe it's our industry, but the majority seem to be remote full time, and then the next category are the hybrids. But Chris, I mean, you're a bit of a pioneer. I mean, you've been working remotely for, well, I don't sound ignorant here, but you've been working remotely for donkey's years, haven't you? I mean,
it has been donkey's years, yes.
How long have you been working remotely?
15 years. now.
Wow.
I think. Yes.
Okay, so that was before the term was invented, I suspect.
Yes.
How
Yes.
did you manage in those Teams or Meet or Zoom or all that sort of stuff?
It was tough. I think we had something. I think we had Skype. Did we have Skype or something like that? Yeah. There was something that we used in the organizations that I worked in. So there was something. It wasn't as good. Culturally, it wasn't really expected. So it wasn't as fluid in terms of having meetings in a hybrid situation where people are in the office and somebody is on a video conference. So we've come a long way, and it's quite nice to see it normalized.
And was it hard to move jobs in those days? If you wanted to move jobs, did people say, well, actually, you can't have a job if you're going to work remotely?
I think that was my perception. I didn't try to move because I didn't expect anyone else to take on that, because I didn't think it was accepted enough. But when I did actually start looking for a job and decided, I was quite surprised that a lot of companies were willing to allow me to continue my arrangement. So I think there's a perception that it wasn't accepted, but I think a lot of companies did do it anyway.
I think
Right.
Karen Gerber may win our prize for the person who's worked remote for the longest. So she says here she's worked remotely since 1995. I'm terribly sorry, Karen. I can't remember which company you worked for, but maybe put that in the comments. And she says how she used to work in those days was faxes. Oh, remember faxes? AOL. Karen said she was the first remote employee at PHH. Absolutely. So just incredible then what it was like back in those days.
Yeah.
But now, of course, as we've seen, everybody is working either remotely or hybrid in our industry. But clearly, working remotely isn't for every industry and for every level. I mean, Russ, in your experience, which are the sectors which are most and levels which are most resistant to working remotely?
Well, you can imagine it's those companies that employ folks who need to be on the ground doing physical work. You think about manufacturing, you think about hospitality, you think about industries where people really need to be customer facing and in a specific location. That's where you're naturally going to see less acceptance and embracing of remote work. But by far, by a huge measure, technology has led the way in terms of being the sector that has embraced remote work. And, a majority of tech employees are remote today. And while, we're going to see ebbs and flows, and as Dharmesh shared, Meta is the latest to kind of take a pull back on remote working, but I think the tech sector will continue. Alu and Pris, your industry is right there second. Media companies have really embraced remote working, and the roles that you employ certainly are suited to that. So not surprised to see that you have very evolved and mature programs in place. So yeah, it's a great variance, but across all sectors, there are roles that are suited to remote working. So even, some of those manufacturing companies, they may have some of their corporate folks out remote. So you see it everywhere for sure.
I think,
and Olu, sorry, just bringing Olu into the conversation here, and then I'll come back to you, Pris, if I may, is that, Olu, in your experience, I mean, in your company, do you work remotely, or how often do you have to go into the office?
2 days a week at work and 3 days remote. But
is that your choice? Is that your choice? Is that company mandate?
I think they're quite flexible. In my team, in my wider team, our head of HR was okay for us to do 2 days in the office, 3 days at home. But from after Easter, it's going to switch to 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. So it will be good if all the team members are in the office at the same time, so that they can collaborate and have FaceTime together. But
that's interesting. So yeah, the pendulum does seem to be moving. Pris, sorry, you were going to say, I cut across you earlier. You were going to
that's
say.
okay. I think there is a cultural element in this, because one of the things that you lose with people working remotely is the culture of the company. And especially for young people who are coming into the organization, for them to be able to understand how the culture has been constructed in an organization, they tend to need that face-to-face rather than a remote working. So I think that's being lost a little bit in there, and I think there's a need for it. But also in our industry, I'm sure all will probably agree, creativity doesn't really work that well. Yes, we can work technically remotely, but when people are being creative, they tend to be in the same room exchanging ideas. And so there is, I think, from a professional perspective, our people tend to want to go into work because of that.
Because
Yeah,
so in Publicis, it's very much then about you can work remotely temporarily for 6 weeks. But
We do have, in terms of that, that's for international, right? Well, it's actually being used mostly for international, but you can work remotely. Like people could go to Scotland, or I can go to Sicily. But for sort of going into the office, most of the countries have a hybrid program in place, but most people choose to go into the office more often than is required of them.
Okay, I mean, got another question that's come up here. So interested in your views. Maybe John, if you could take this one. What about international remote work requests? Do organisations offer that, and for how long? I mean, obviously, what Publicis is doing, but just more generally, John.
Yeah, more generally, and I would also point to, we did our own white paper, but you also did a very good survey on it. Benevo did on your website.
Which I think we'll post that in the comments whilst you're talking.
Exactly. So what you see is, first of all, it depends on the company and the industry. It depends on the company culture. It depends on the industry. So obviously, industries that are heavily regulated, like banking, for example, or that are typically manufacturing, for example, there's much less ability to offer international remote work, for example. But for the ones that do have it and that are in that kind of war for talent, for example, you'll see a kind of a gradient of more, let's say, days that are being allowed. Like, for example, if you go onto HubSpot's careers page, they offer up to 90 days international remote working. Now, of course, these companies don't offer it in every country in the world. They have a select many of countries that they offer it in. So typically what you see is a typical one would be many companies would have, for example, 30 days within Europe and maybe 15 days outside of Europe, for example, or maybe 60 and 30, for example. It really depends. But the most important thing is that when they're doing it, that they are keeping an eye on the risks. They're managing like the really crucial ones, like, for example, permanent establishment, that they make sure that they're compliant with the visa side. But part of the challenge on the visa side, for example, is that not all countries themselves have caught up from a regulatory perspective, including from tax. And that's why, for example, you'll see the likes of OECD, the likes of also the European Union, they're working on legislation to try and get this, to catch up the country legislation with remote working, because this dynamic is having a huge shift on immigration.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? I just want to change the topic slightly, go a bit off piece. And maybe Dharmesh, you could pick up on this. What about the question about duty of care? I mean, if you're saying that somebody can go and work anywhere remotely, what happens if something happens?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brian. I think what challenges which I have observed across organizations is that while most organizations have a global health coverage policy in place, but not necessarily it's applicable for employees who get approved on remote work arrangements for a temporary time. I mean, those might apply to, let's say, long-term assignments for expatriates or short-term assignments, but not necessarily for remote work. So I think that's one place where I think organizations will have to kind of look at whether they want to expand that insurance coverage for remote work arrangement as well. I think the essence that's what rightly earlier said is that remote work is largely an employee-driven request versus an employer-driven request, because from an employer-driven, they would rather have an assignment in place, whether it's a short-term or long-term assignment to carry out the business objectives. So I think, and from an organization perspective as well, I think it's a fine balance, because in a current cost-conscious environment, to know whether they would be willing to sponsor work visas for remote work arrangements or to even have these global insurance coverages for employees, I think it's a real tough one for them as well.
And talking of being cost conscious, there's one interesting aspect of what you guys do at Publicis, Chris, that I don't think we've touched on. But as I understand it, and please tell me more, you let employees do house swaps as well as part of this transfer. How does that work? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. Yes, we work with an organization, so a platform to help people match houses. So it's not a monetary program, so people will house swap, if I want to come to the UK and somebody wants to let me sleep on their couch for 6 weeks, I could do that. So it's quite successful. People are using it a lot, and it's helping people, because one of the big challenges especially for more junior people, is the cost of being able to be living for 6 weeks somewhere and having to fork out accommodation. So that's been really helpful for a lot of people.
Okay, so I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, that's certainly a very different way of doing things. I mean, do we think, there is this trade-off for us, you talked about it, between the employer and the employee. The employee is trying to sort of, keep control of their organization, and the employee is looking at it. But from an employee experience perspective, do you think offering remote work enhances, I'm guessing it must, enhances employee experience? Or do you think actually that, that management is right and it's better to sort of make sure people aren't too remote?
It's the number one reason that we see companies citing for embracing remote work, is to focus on the employee experience. And I noticed some of the comments coming through were also focused on kind of the need to shore up team building and kind of employee engagement. Those are very difficult things to maintain when we're all scattered out, working from our homes and from all corners of the world. And we do see companies beginning to step up and offer things like more defined mentorship programs and provide for routine travel to locations for teams to come together in a single location and engage in team building. So there definitely is an emerging focus on that employee experience and how that intersects remote work. And I think we're going to continue to see more of that.
Okay, so we're getting towards the close of our hour. I'm just going to bring Julia Onslow-Cole back into the conversation. Julia, I mean, you've been hearing all this, and obviously you look at it with an immigration hat. Where do you think this is going to end up from your perspective? You're on mute.
I think companies are going to be a little bit more strict. I think you were saying like the balance of power is slightly shifting, and I think companies are being strict. And I did say that in my immigration roundup. What we're seeing more is more companies saying, well, you can do it for a shorter period, but you have to have immigration permission already. Whereas at the very beginning, they were sponsoring almost any kind of digital nomad visa. So I think companies are very wary now. They've been a little bit caught out with sort of some of the tax consequences, inadvertent PEs. And I think, so I think companies might. But then on the other hand, I think a lot of individuals will always be attracted to it because it's such an attractive way of living, isn't it? So the demand for it will still be there, and maybe as well the self-employed people, it will be very attractive as well.
Yeah, we haven't really got into tax, and that was almost deliberate from my perspective, because I think the first question, which is what we've been talking about, is do you want to have remote working as an employer? Do you want to have remote working as an employee? You can then look at, once you've decided those strategic questions, you can then look at, well, how are we going to make this work? What are the tax guide rails, the immigration guide rails we've got to live within? But the first thing is actually this almost power struggle, which I think is going on from the great resignation of a year and a half ago to the great layoffs that we're going to see at the moment, and the way the world is changing. The balance of power is moving as the dust of the pandemic sort of falls away. But I think it is a subject that is evolving, and we will come back to it. Unfortunately, we are getting very much to the close of our time now. So all that really remains is for me to thank this amazing panel we've had today. We've had Olu Yuba, who, as I said, those testimonials we saw for you, I've never seen anything like them.
Thank you.
The love that was there for you was amazing. Dharmesh, you've got so much experience. It's so much great to have you on the show. Russ, as ever, it's been absolutely brilliant to have you on the show with all your insights. And I know you've got lots of great research for anybody who's interested. John, what you're doing is truly groundbreaking in terms of the business you're building, work from anywhere. Kudos to you. If anybody hasn't seen John's website, then I do recommend you check it out. And I think there are.
It's amazing. I can vouch for that. It's truly amazing website. I think all
Thank you very
companies
much.
need
And we'll give it a plug because I think that you can
Appreciate
also do a free sort of, there's a freemium model, isn't there, or something? You can take
Exactly.
it out and use
Anybody
it.
can go onto the website, wfa.team, and they can access a 7-day trial and take a look and play around with it themselves. And really appreciate all the feedback and support, and for having me on the show. I think it's been a really great discussion, Brian.
Sure, and it's
.team, TEAM.
WFA.team. Okay, and then last but by no means least, Chris, amazing having you on the show. I know you've been on the show before. Great having you back on the show, and in particular for telling us all about your work, your world policy. And as I think people posted, there is a YouTube video on it. So if you Google it or go on YouTube, you can find all about what Publicis has done, which was one of the very earliest companies to do something that innovative. And as I said, huge kudos to everybody. And actually, I'll take Tara Hagen there as the final words from everybody. Thanks to everybody. Happy holidays. It's the holiday season now. And it's just been great. And then we are back next week when we're going to be talking to Mark Eckert from Uber, who's going to be telling us all about global mobility at Uber, which will be fascinating. And as I mentioned, we will also have a chance for you to win a free ticket to the Emma in Dallas, as well as 3 nights free accommodation, courtesy of the Forum for Expatriate Management. So that's it for me. I'm Brian Friedman. It's been great talking to you all. Have a great week and have a very happy holiday period. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.